The All-Star game has come and gone, thank goodness. I don't know about you, but the game itself left a little bit to be desired, at least for this viewer. But All-Star Weekend is also a fun event, and all the activities and festivities featured two Memphis Grizzlies, not just one, but two. We're going to talk about what that means, some other thoughts from the weekend, and whether or not Memphis can ever host an All-Star game on this episode of Locked On Grizzlies. Let's lock in.
You are Locked On Grizzlies, your daily Memphis Grizzlies podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to another episode of Locked On Grizzlies. I am your host, Joe Mullinax. Happy to be with you here on this Monday. Wonderful, wonderful weekend of basketball, or at least the events of basketball, to say the least. So hopefully you had a great weekend. I know I did, and I'm excited to be back with you here on Locked On Grizzlies. We are a proud part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team each and every single day. We are free and available wherever you get your podcasts. You can check us out on any podcast channel imaginable, it seems, and you can check us out over on YouTube. Like, comment, rate, review, subscribe. It's all good. It's all appreciated by myself and my co-host, Michael Cole. I am, of course, Joe Mullinax, and I'm still flying solo, still thinking of DeMichael and his family as they're going through a difficult time. He will be back when he comes back, and it'll be wonderful to have DeMichael back when the time comes, but he is exactly where he needs to be right now. And our thoughts stay with DeMichael and the entire Cole crew. It was the All-Star weekend. I don't know if you caught that or not on your various social media channels and all the different things you check out content-wise on a daily basis. It was the NBA All-Star game, and there were some highlights and some lowlights. We'll talk more about that later on in the show. But the first thing I want to address is the reality that is the fact that John Morant and Jaren Jackson Jr. both made appearances in said All-Star game. Now, they might have been relatively tame performances, especially when you compare them to, Jason Tatum, who had a phenomenal game. I mean, he went off. This guy was 22 of 31. And again, this usually happens at the All-Star game, right? They play the first half. They see who's feeling good, who's not feeling good, and they'll decide who's going to make a push for the MVP and go from there. Like, Ja took 4 shots in 20 minutes of play, right? Like, it wasn't really for Ja. Although, fun with plus minus, guess who led Team Giannis in plus minus for the game? Ja Morant. He got robbed. He should have been the MVP, not Jason Tatum. Come on. Just kidding, of course. But obviously, even using a stat like plus minus in any single game is kind of foolish by itself, but especially in an exhibition game like the All-Star game, it is especially a foolhardy venture. Jason Tatum was impressive, 10 made threes. Donovan Mitchell, 8 of 17 from 3, another really strong performance. But half the points scored by Team Giannis were scored by those two guys, right? Damian Lillard came off the bench. He chucked some shots. He took 20 threes. Only 1 2-point bucket from Damian Lillard. These are the kinds of stats you read in an All-Star game or an All-Star game. Joel Embiid and Kyrie Irving both played pretty well. Jaylen Brown coming off of the bench for Team LeBron. Both LeBron and Giannis. Giannis had sprained his wrist in the last game leading up to the All-Star weekend. So he taped up and he played literally like 15 seconds, scored the first bucket of the game, and got himself out of the contest. LeBron played 14 minutes and did some good things for his team, but he hurt his finger on the rim, pulled himself out. So it was a hit or miss game. And to be honest with you, for me, it was largely a miss game. I'm not a huge fan of these exhibition type games. It's feeling more and more like the Pro Bowl to me. And the Pro Bowl has obviously devolved to a state where it's not even real football anymore, right? It's flag football, 7-on-7, essentially. They might as well not even play the game. I don't know that we're quite there yet. For the NBA, the acts of athleticism that these massive human beings are able to pull off are still pretty impressive to watch live. John Morant had multiple impressive dunks. You saw that from, a variety of players, self alley-oops, all sorts of different things. But when it devolves at the end, I mentioned on Twitter, it looked like me and my buddies at my old man pickup game that we play, chucking up threes. A couple of them were air balls. Yeah, they were close to half court, but the fact they were being chucked at all. And again, I was told that defense would be played in the fourth quarter. And while they did give a little more effort, exhibition game wise, this put the X into exhibition for me, crossing it out of my memory. But the thing that I am going to hold on to, the thing that's going to stick with me, is the fact that the Memphis Grizzlies had 2 representatives. And it's not just that. I don't know if you saw this or not, but Mount 12 Ski, I believe it was called, Nike basketball, had a pop-up store there in Salt Lake City, built out, literally made out of ice in a lot of areas, if not completely made out of ice. And they were selling Jaw 1s, the Midnight Jaw 1, which is my personal favorite. That's the one. If anybody was in Salt Lake City and was able to grab a few pairs of those, if you want, I'll find you on Venmo. I'll send you some money. The fact that the Grizzlies have a player that has a Nike pop-up store and is selling his signature debut shoe and other items of attire, the Memphis Grizzlies have that guy. And that shouldn't be lost on us. That remains significant. No disrespect to Marc Gasol, but they weren't doing that for him. Maybe they would make a paella in his honor or something like that, or a gardening tool. Later, maybe he would have an endorsement from a gardening company, the way that his career, and it helped him, obviously, down the stretch. I don't mean to make light of Gasol's contributions. He, in my opinion, was the best player in the history of the Memphis Grizzlies organization until Ja Morant. And Ja Morant's only 23 years old, but it's getting harder and harder to not say that Ja Morant is the best player in the history of the Memphis Grizzlies. Sure, you'd like to see him make the Western Conference Finals, and sure, you would like to have him be in a position where he gets, he was most improved player last year, but another all-NBA team, those sorts of things. But again, that feels like nitpicking at this point, doesn't it? And don't get me wrong, I'm usually the king of nitpicking. I pick nits with everybody. I have very unpopular opinions all the time. At least to others, they're unpopular. I don't know why they're yelling at me. I'm right. I am that meme. But Ja Morant is rising those ranks if he's not already there. And Jaren Jackson Jr. isn't too far behind him. A likely winner of Defensive Player of the Year at this stage, and him not having a larger role in the All-Star game, that's not really too surprising, right? He's a defensive first player. He has offensive weapons. He's able to score, get to the basket, do all those sorts of things that we've talked about here, there, and everywhere on Locked On Grizzlies. But that's not something that's really valued in an All-Star game, right? The game of Donovan Mitchell, the game of Damian Lillard, the game of Jason Tatum. Those are games that are valued in exhibition style contests. And Ja Morant, aside from a couple of highlight dunks, not as conducive to that style of play. Jaren's game certainly is not conducive. And he was also a first-time All-Star, right? So there's a lot of reasons for him to not have the numbers, perhaps, that maybe he could have or should have had, should he have been invested in a little bit more. But we have to keep in mind, this is the showcase of the NBA Immortals, right? To borrow a line and paraphrase from WWE and WrestleMania. This is the top 24 in theory. Obviously, Steph Curry not there, Zion Williamson, up and down. KD, Kevin Durant wasn't there. So members of the top 30 or so players in the entire NBA. And the Grizzlies had 2 of them. And again, Ja Morant had a pop-up store for Nike, and Jaren Jackson Jr. was mic'd up on his practice, the All-Star practice. These guys are being asked about dunk contests, and Jaren's being elected vice president or a vice president of the NBPA, the Players Association. So there is so much that comes out of this weekend for the Memphis Grizzlies that fans, the organization, they should be thrilled about. And I think that we need to continue to keep that context and pause and smell the roses a little bit, stop and smell them, because you've got 2 guys that are 23 years old that just played in the All-Star game, and they both played for the Memphis Grizzlies, and they've represented the franchise well on the national stage. And now hopefully they get a couple of days off and they get to rest up a little bit, and they get to have a chance to enjoy themselves before they come back Wednesday, you'd imagine, try to get a practice in before their game Thursday on the road in Philadelphia on national television. It's right back to the grind, and it's going to be a sprint to the finish now. The Grizzlies are closer to the 3 seed than they are to the 1. They have to try to make up some of that ground and solidify their claim to the second best spot in the Western Conference. We're going to talk more about the rest of the weekend. We'll talk about All-Star Saturday night in particular next here on Locked On Grizzlies. But first, this episode of Locked On Grizzlies is brought to you by the Nissan Ariya, Nissan's most electric player of the week. Let's go ahead and give it to Jason Tatum just for fun, right? The All-Star game was last night. Jason Tatum was electric. Shout out to the Boston Celtics. They had two players there. Jaylen Brown also had a really strong All-Star performance, but Jason Tatum deserves to be the player of the electric player of the week. He has an extremely electric performance in the All-Star game. It was fierce. It was elegant. He really did a remarkable job combining the skill of scoring with his stunningly powerful play. Really pretty solid stuff in terms of what Jason Tatum was capable of doing. He's kind of the perfect player for the modern NBA, just like the Ariya is the perfect SUV crossover. The 2023 Nissan Ariya packs pin-to-your-seat power and premium intelligence all in one EV. The all-new, all-electric 2023 Nissan Ariya, the EV for people who love to drive. Shop now at nissanusa.com. When we come back, we're talking All-Star Saturday night in particular and taking a look at two guys who are more similar than you'd think next here on Locked On Grizzlies. Welcome back to Locked On Grizzlies. I am your host, Joe Mullinax, once again flying solo, missing DeMichael Cole of the Commercial Appeal, my co-host. He'll be back soon, I hope, when he's ready, of course. We continue to send our thoughts to DeMichael and his family. It was a busy weekend for the NBA. Obviously, we talked about earlier in the show, the Grizzlies and the busyness that they experienced. Over at my Substack, Written in the Dark, I wrote about a lot of what we talked about in that first segment, the idea of these two guys representing Memphis well, the fact they were even there being a major win for the Memphis Grizzlies. Obviously, the Grizzlies did not have as much of a presence on Saturday night. There really weren't any Grizzlies involved. You had Kenneth Lofton, who performed in the Rising Stars game. That's a separate entity that I'll save for our next episode. But I do believe that when you look at All-Star Saturday night, in a lot of ways, that was kind of the highlight of the weekend for a lot of people. At least for me growing up, it was. Whether it was a three-point contest, the dunk contest, those were always my two favorites. You know, the Vince Carter highlights, Aaron Gordon in more recent years, Dwight Howard as well in the past, doing really successful dunks. The three-point contest is always a fun display of skill. For whatever reason, it didn't seem to have the same energy going into it. At least for me, it didn't. You know, the top three-point shooters in the league, only one of them, Buddy Hield, was actually represented in the three-point shooting contest. The dunk contest was more G League than it was NBA. So it had a lack of recognizable names. It had a lack of actual deservedness. Is that a word? Deserving candidates. And that made it seem a little bit less interesting. At least to me, it did, at least to this viewer. But as things often do, people show up, show out, compete, and the story coming out of it isn't about the lack of names. It's, you know, the what those people did. You know, Damian Lillard having an amazing performance in the three-point shooting contest, going out there and winning that, and Tyrese Halliburton had a great showing as well. But Lillard of the Trailblazers goes and displays tremendous talent. And then Mac McClung was the star of the show, right? The star of the night was Mac McClung, signs his first NBA deal, essentially, with the Philadelphia 76ers, and then a couple days later goes out and wins the NBA Slam Dunk Contest. Now, I'm going to say, if you watch Locked On Grizzlies, dear listener, dear viewer, if you listen, however you take in the show, you know that I predicted Mac McClung to win the dunk contest. I predicted Lauri Markkanen to win the three-point contest. We can just ignore that, right? We can just forget. Hopefully you didn't place too much money on that one. But hopefully you bet a lot on Mac McClung, because that was easy money. I'm from the state of Virginia. I live in the state of Virginia. I've known about Mac McClung for a long time. I have seen his viral dunk highlights of him in high school. So I had a sneaky suspicion that he was going to show out in the All-Star Dunk Contest, and he did. Shout out to Gate City. Stand up. But what really, the main thing that I took away from All-Star Saturday night, aside from the fact that I went into it not very confident that it was going to be good, and it actually turned out pretty solid, at least in my opinion. Damian Lillard and Mac McClung are very similar. And obviously, I don't mean it in the exact same way. Damian Lillard, Mac McClung, aside from sharing the stage of being the two largest individual event winners of Saturday night, I wrote about over at SB Nation NBA today, you should go check it out, how they share an uncertain future beyond All-Star Saturday night. For example, the Portland Trailblazers, as of this moment, are not a playoff team. They are a play-in team, which means they are solidly an NBA lottery team. And they also, at the trade deadline, made a lot of moves that looked a lot more like a rebuilding team than a team trying to contend for the postseason. They traded away Josh Hart. They traded away Gary Payton II. And they bring back Cam Reddish. And they get some draft capital that's valuable. But again, that looks like something that a rebuilding team would do, not one with one of the top 15 players in the National Basketball Association and Damian Lillard on their team. Oh, and by the way, Damian Lillard is arguably having the best season of his career. He is posting career highs in usage and points per shot attempt, according to Cleaning the Glass. He is doing things that have not been done by him before. And Lillard is a really freaking good basketball player to begin with before his current state of play. And yet the Portland Trailblazers, if they're lucky, will be a play-in team. Now, the West is pretty crowded, as we've talked about before, and we'll talk more about this week. You know, we don't have any games until Thursday, so we have a few days of episodes here that we can talk about the lay of the land in the Western Conference. The Portland Trailblazers are currently 12 and a half games back of the 1 seed. They're also just a half game out of the play-in. They're only 2 games out of the 6 seed. So everything is very condensed, right? The Sacramento Kings are currently the 3 seed in the Western Conference. They are 8 games back of the Denver Nuggets. The Portland Trailblazers are 4.5 games back of the Kings. So the Trailblazers, even though they are currently the 12 seed out west, are closer to the 3 seed than the Memphis Grizzlies are to the 1 seed. Pretty remarkable. That's how tightly packed and condensed the Western Conference is. So could the Trailblazers turn things around and get into the play-in? Yeah, pretty easily, right? They win a couple of games and they're back in that mix if the right teams lose. And there's squads like Oklahoma City Thunder that are playing over their heads, right? Utah Jazz made very much some trades that were rebuilding trades. So Utah will probably not be a contender. It's likely the Lakers, the Trailblazers, and, you know, the Thunder for that last play-in spot. I would see the Warriors getting in, the Timberwolves, the Pelicans, you know, basically everybody beyond that's going to be in the playoffs. So number 10 is really where things get interesting in the West. And Portland's in that conversation. But they didn't really do anything at the trade deadline to make that conversation more interesting. And that's surprising. McClung is in a similar boat in terms of uncertainty, but in a much different way. He was a social media superstar on Saturday night. Everybody said on the broadcast and elsewhere, this made McClung. McClung's a star. He's played in 4 NBA games in his career. Again, you can't look at the dunk contest from this year through the same lens that you've looked at other dunk contests. This was Trey Murphy III, second-year player that folks argue on Twitter should be a Memphis Grizzly and not a New Orleans Pelican. But that's neither here nor there. I still like Zaire Williams personally. But that guy was arguably the most well-known name of the 4. So it was not like Jordan or Carter or Gordon or Howard. Those guys weren't in the mix. And John Morant has made it clear that he is not participating in the dunk contest at any point. He has said he will never do the dunk contest unless maybe it's held in Memphis, which we'll talk more about here in a moment. But I think that the issue for McClung, the issue for Lillard is last Saturday night felt like it might be the peak of their seasons. In the case of McClung, the peak of their career. And they shared that stage of uncertainty. The Portland Trailblazers are probably going to be in that 10 seed, 9 seed mix, right? They're not going to completely tumble out. But Damian Lillard is close to an MVP level right now. He's a top 10 or so player in the NBA. McClung was the rage of the party all over Salt Lake City Saturday night and on social media everywhere. Has McClung arrived? He's got to be in the rotation first. And the Philadelphia 76ers are trying to compete for a championship. Do you think McClung is cracking that rotation? It's unlikely. So uncertainty for both McClung and Lillard coming out of a pretty impressive All-Star Saturday night. I wrote about that over at SB Nation NBA. Go check it out. It's live on Monday morning. So it should be live depending on when you're watching or listening to this by that time. Thanks for checking it out. And thanks for checking out my Substack Written in the Dark as well. It's appreciated. This episode of Locked On Grizzlies is brought to you by my personal favorite snack bar, Built Bar. It's a delicious treat without all the fat and calories. We're trying to eat healthier. I'm getting on the treadmill as we speak almost daily. I'm getting my exercise. We got to try Built Bar in order to help supplement our healthy pursuits, because healthy is actually tasty with Built Bar. Real chocolate, 100% real chocolate on these bars. They come in flavors like churro, peanut butter brownie, coconut almond. I'm not sure how they do it, but only 130 calories, 4 grams of sugar, a whopping 17 grams of protein. And the beauty of these Built bars, folks, is you can get them at built.com, of course, but you can also go to Sam's Club. You can go to Walmart. You can go to Walmart and get a 4-bar box of cookies and cream, double chocolate, coconut puffs. You can go to Sam's Club, get a brownie batter or a churro. They're fantastic. So, of course, go check out built.com. Get yourself some flavors sent to your house. But go to your local Walmart, go to your Sam's Club, and give Built Bar a shot. They are going to help you eat healthier and also not skimp on the flavor. When we come back here on Locked On Grizzlies, I am going to prognosticate. I'm going to predict what it will take for a market like Memphis to host the NBA All-Star game. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back to Locked On Grizzlies. I am your host for this episode, Joe Mullinax, once again flying solo to Michael Cole. We'll be back when he's able to be. We missed a Michael, but we understand, of course, and we look forward to his return eventually. We've talked about All-Star performances, the Grizzlies earlier in the show, and then, of course, just recently talking about how McClung and Damian Lillard share an uncertainty that the Memphis Grizzlies can't relate to, right? It's pretty certain at this point they're going to be in the playoffs. And there were a lot of, Raptor 538 and all the different measurements that these season predicting websites use. And most of them like the Grizzlies' chances, not just to hold on to the 2 seed, but to make it above and beyond into the Western Conference Finals, which after seeing the Phoenix Suns, or what they did at the trade deadline, after watching the Clippers, after seeing what all these squads are trying to do, I'm not as confident as I was, I'll be honest, and we'll talk more about that later on this week. But the Grizzlies still have a really good basketball team, and it's impossible almost that they fall out of the playoff conversation. It's improbable that they fall too far below the 4 seed, and it's more than likely that they're going to stay right where they are. They're kind of hard to catch depending on the team that you believe in. So this will be the second consecutive year that they are in and around the 2 seed of the Western Conference, which means that this is the second consecutive year they're one of the top 5 or so teams in the NBA. We mentioned earlier in the show they have 2 young stars, a superstar in Morant and a young star in Jaren Jackson Jr. They're under the age of 24. Desmond Bane is in that conversation. He is 24. They are the most successful young team in the NBA. But they are in a small market like Memphis. So will they ever be able to host an All-Star game? A ray of hope, at least for me, came shining through on social media when reports came out that Milwaukee was putting in a bid to host a future All-Star game, 2025 or 2026. Indianapolis in particular, is hosting the 2024 All-Star game. And that makes total sense. If you've ever been to Indianapolis, it's one of the best cities to hold an event like that. Final Four, Super Bowls. It's one of the top 4 or 5 in the country. The way that it's laid out, everything is walkable. It's really pretty impressive. Highly recommend you go check it out if you've never done so. So if Milwaukee and Indiana, and again, Indianapolis is a little bit different. If Milwaukee can host an All-Star game, what would it take for Memphis to host an All-Star game? Now, you may have heard people talk about this before, and it starts with the ability to house the kinds of people that would come into town for an All-Star game. And I'm not just talking basic hotels, right? Like Spike Lee's not staying at, a Motel 6. And I know that Memphis has grown and developed since I left Memphis in 2014, almost a decade ago. I know there's been some development, there's been some adjustments, some rearranging downtown. It's not just the existence of hotel rooms, it's luxury hotels. It's being able to provide for the clientele that is part of All-Star Weekend, because it's not just the NBA that comes to town. You've got the celebrity game. You've got all sorts of different folks that want to see and be seen at these type of things. Just go back to Sunday night. Look at the folks that were around the floor trying to get a glimpse and hang out with these all-star NBA players. Are they coming to Memphis and being willing to stay at the Peabody? Maybe. But they are more accustomed to more modern and upscale types of hotels, and Memphis has some of that. But do they have enough of that to be able to house and sustain? That's an interesting question. In terms of the airport and the infrastructure, those sorts of things exist because of FedEx, obviously, and other items. But it's not just about the Grizzlies are good. Hey, Joe, why are you being a hater? Ja Morant's really good. He's a superstar. If he is truly the heir apparent as the face of the NBA, which more and more people are saying, if that is the case, wouldn't it make sense for, Ja Morant in his prime in 2027 to host an All-Star game? Yeah, it would make sense. Sure. But what's the functionality of it? Do they have the capacity to be able to house all the different types of people that would come in for the game? Do they have the ability to make it a week of events? Because again, it's not just the game. It is the HBCU game. It is the All-Star Saturday night. It is all of the pomp and circumstance that goes along with these kinds of events that go beyond just playing a basketball game. If it was just playing a basketball game, Memphis does that with their eyes closed, right? Hoop City. That's not the concern. It's about developing an infrastructure in and around FedEx Forum downtown that would enable for these various folks from all sorts of walks of life to be able to land in Memphis, go to the game, go to all of the wonderful restaurants. And that's another thing, right? Memphis has amazing food, but do they have the types of places? And it's not to say Salt Lake City is, a cultural smorgasbord, but they have the scope, they have the size, they have the capacity. Memphis is the best little big city in America, at least in my opinion, because it has a lot of what a big city has, like a professional sports team in the Memphis Grizzlies, but they also have a lot of what smaller cities and towns have. They are not overrun, overpopulated. There isn't, unspeakable traffic each and every day that you never want to even try to get into the city. Obviously, Memphis has its issues, but all cities do. And what makes Memphis less likely to host an All-Star game isn't the quality of their team. It's the quality of the businesses and infrastructure around them. Could that change in 4 years? Sure. You can build a couple hotels. You can make an investment. You could show Adam Silver in the NBA what is being done in Memphis. Because again, I know there's been a lot of change for the better. If there are things that can be done to prove to the league that you can handle the load of hosting one of these events, I find it hard to believe that Milwaukee is that much more advanced in terms of these types of hotels, in terms of these types of business ventures, these restaurants. Obviously, the NBA loves places like Miami. All leagues like hosting things in Miami. Las Vegas is a popular spot. Los Angeles, of course. New York, of course. But in markets like Milwaukee, markets like Indiana and Indianapolis, that is where a lot of fans are too. In Memphis, if they were able to establish themselves, not necessarily as just a good basketball team, because they're already there, but as a team that is capable of hosting, a city that is capable of hosting such an event, then you'll see an All-Star game in Memphis. But again, it would take more hotels and luxury hotels, more fine dining, those sorts of things, the infrastructure around the city. Those things do exist. Again, I love Memphis. I don't want to hate on it. I'm not hating on it. I wish that these things didn't matter. If it was just about great basketball and being a great basketball city and having high IQ and loving the game, Memphis checks all those boxes, ding, 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 ring the bell. But it's not just about that. It's about a variety of other things that aren't necessarily even within the control of the Grizzlies organization. Obviously, Memphis is getting some additions and changes to FedEx Forum. I know the governor of Tennessee passed $350 million, I believe it was, down and around to Memphis to help with building a soccer stadium, I think, and helping rebuild from the inside out FedEx Forum, or at least a massive update, because FedEx Forum's still relatively new, but it could use some updating if you've been there. I would love to see it, but it has to go beyond just updating the arena. There are other additions and changes that would need to be done, and again, that are necessarily outside of the Grizzlies' control, or aren't necessarily within their control. So maybe one day it's a good thing to dream about, but it seems unlikely at this time. Something that is likely is John Morant being there almost every year at this point. And then Jaren Jackson Jr., maybe he makes it a couple more times. And we'll talk about that in our next episode of Locked On Grizzlies as well. Thank you for making Locked On Grizzlies your first listen today. Now go make your second listen game-to-game NBA. Every moment, every top performance, every result. Locked On game-to-game, covers every game from across the NBA with local analysis that only Locked On can deliver. Follow Game to Game on Locked On NBA, available on the Odyssey app, YouTube, and wherever you get podcasts. The next time we're together, it'll be a Tuesday episode, and again, no games for a while. So we'll take a look at that Jaren Jackson Jr. question. Ja figures to be an all-star as long as he's healthy for the foreseeable future. But what about Jaren, a guy that defensively has a really strong game? Could this be the only all-star game Jaren Jackson Jr. ever makes? We'll talk about that. We'll also start to take a closer look at the lay of the land in the Western Conference, the early schedule, the immediate start of the sprint to the playoffs. All that's coming. The playoffs start in 2 months. 2 months, it's going to be here before you know it. So it's a sprint to the finish. We're going to start talking about that. And again, Jaren's place in it, obviously looking at the state of the roster, all those sort of things over the next couple of episodes of Locked On Grizzlies. Thank you so much for listening, rating, reviewing, subscribing, liking, commenting, wherever you get your podcasts on YouTube. Make sure you continue to make us a part of your Memphis Grizzlies experience. It is much appreciated. Until next time, until tomorrow, have a wonderful day. Have a wonderful rest of your All-Star Monday. I'll see you on Tuesday. Stay locked in. This is Locked On Grizzlies.